So we're super excited to be here with all of you as we explore this book chapter with Monica, Kate, and Eve, and Brandon will introduce them shortly. But before we begin that, we just wanted to acknowledge that our programming with Michigan State University Extension is open to anyone and everyone. This is something we strive for with our programming, and it is in part one of the reasons why we are recording this session. We will be editing it and making it available closed caption online following the session to make sure that more people can access this information. Before we begin this discussion of the book chapter, we wanted to provide a land acknowledgement. As we share, we encourage all of you to share the Indigenous land you are currently on in the chat. So we collectively acknowledge that Michigan occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, Michigan State University resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federal recognized Indian nations, for historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, for Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold ourselves more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. So thank you for those that have shared in the chat, and continue to share in the chat as we continue with this presentation. And also wanted to thank Monica for sharing this resource with all of us. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Brandon Schroeder, who will give an introduction of our Center for Great Lakes Literacy.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. Super excited. Welcome everyone. Super excited for this conversation being facilitated through our Center for Great Lakes Literacy. The Center for Great Lakes Literacy is really a regional Great Lakes-wide education partnership among our Michigan Sea Grant educators, working with our many Great Lakes and natural resource education partners in all of our respective states, and really emphasizing our focus and work on promoting Great Lakes literacy and learning, providing support for educators and direct student engagement opportunities in connection with these Great Lakes literacy principles, which are really those principles that we believe not only every educator and student, but every citizen in our states, our country, our world ought to know about our Great Lakes. As we talked, and this is an important time and a really timely and exciting conversation to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. As we talked among our Seagull team, we really wanted to say, how do we have a conversation on how to make our programs even better by really critically thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in our programming. And, it's been an honor for me to work with one of our newest colleagues, Dr. Monica Miles from the New York Sea Grant program, who has been a really important thought leader in this area of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and has really brought us a great opportunity to have that conversation as a Seagull Sea Grant education team. And in this afternoon's discussion, we really just said, hey, we should be sharing this conversation with all of our partners and networks in our respective states. So we opened this up into a panel discussion type of a format, and we're just really excited to have everyone here to join in what I believe is going to be a great conversation. And with that, I'll introduce, if we go to the next slide, I'm going to introduce Dr. Monica Miles and Dr. Kate Hawk and Eve Shippens, who have collaborated on this book chapter that we're framing our discussion around this afternoon. And what I'd like to do, what's neat about the three of their voices together is they really enter into this conversation from different perspectives and angles. And just in talking with them yesterday, I'm excited about the rich conversation that I know we're about to have. So with that, I'll start with you, Monica, to introduce yourself a bit more, and then we'll go to Kate and Eve.
Absolutely. So my name is Monica Miles. I was born and raised in Buffalo, and that's where I am today. And for me, even doing this work through New York Sea Grant is just a way for me to connect the things that I have done throughout my career as a race, equity, and STEM education scholar. It's like, you can do this work, right? So you can talk all this equity talk, but if you cannot make change in your own backyard, then what are we doing, right? And so that's one of the things that I have been kind of pushing, is that not that we're just picking up conversations of equity, but but thinking about what does it mean with how we engage with partners? How do we engage with educators? How are we engaging with colleagues? And are we equitable in all of those things and creating inclusive spaces? So environmental justice for me has been a lens through which I can do that. So I'll spend less time on my background, but saying that, you know, in this role within New York Sea Grant, I'm able to create and work with very devoted educators in the Great Lakes region to develop and think about what is environmental justice, regardless of their content area, regardless of their grade level. What does it mean for students to be both environmentally aware, but then also critical of where they are, and just empowering them, right? So just remembering that these kids and these educators and everyone that you engage with is a point that can be basically tip the scale on what's happening in our society. So just stepping into it with that.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Kate Hawk, and I was a public school teacher for 26 years. During that time, I was a parent activist within the Buffalo public school system. I was a union rep for my teachers, and I've always been politically active, even as a young person. As a scholar, I'm a literacy professor, and so my belief is that literacy is always political, and access to good education is sort of the fundamental premise of my life. And so I'm not a scientist, but I'm lucky to know Monica, who is. And she and I have been friends and colleagues. And in a lot of our discussions and our work together during our PhD studies, we didn't imagine that we would start seriously working together after school. And that's what we did for this project and some other projects as well. Particularly another project that Monica and I have been working on that's really close to my heart is working on anti-racist, anti-colonizing curriculum at the school where I'm currently teaching. So I was a public school educator. I retired, and now I work at a private school because I couldn't stay out of the classroom. So we are excited to be here today and to talk really particularly about our home, which is Buffalo. I've lived in Buffalo since 1979. I came here to go to Buffalo State College, and then I never left. So I'm a mom of 3 sons, and that is a really important to me that young people get involved in working towards a better world. And so this work is part of that. So I will stop talking and let Eve take over.
Hi, I'm Eve Shippens. I'm a Buffalo public school teacher. I've been teaching in the Buffalo public schools for 19 years. I'm also an alumni of the Buffalo public schools, and I still live in the city. And my 3 kids, my youngest just graduated in June, so all 3 of them went to the Buffalo public schools. So I'm very committed. I've been very committed my whole career in really high quality education in a low income, largely brown and black school system, because it is something that directly, you know, that's the family I came from. I'm a white woman, but I come from a mixed race family. And so racial justice has always been an important thing to me as far as education goes. I do teach science. I've taught it both at the high school level and the middle school level. And currently I've been teaching environmental science for 5 years, which I just absolutely love, because this gives me a chance to actually not teach to a test, and that's very real, and also bring in some of the other skills that I have developed over the years. I am a community activist. I do a lot of union work, and I've been trained by my union and other organizations as an organizer. And so I can bring in some of that kind of knowledge to my classroom.
Awesome. So one of the things I just want to make sure that we touch on before I go into all of the theories and all of that is that this chapter would not have been written in the way that it was without the three of us really thinking through and inserting our voices and our perspectives. And so one of the things that I have been kind of like it's almost like a conundrum, right? So people are like, well, what is environmental justice education and what does it look like? And they're looking for the perfect lesson. And I'm like, well, environmental justice education is place-based education, and it depends on what do inequities look like where you are, right? And so each of us, regardless of what our roles are, right, regardless of what our job is, we are very involved in our communities, right? So that would be the first step. If you're trying to do this environmental justice work, the first thing would be, what community-based organizations are you a part of to really understand and connect and build relationships with those around you, right? So if you don't have that, there is no cute lesson that's going to be developed, right? So, and I've been kind of like, stuck when people are like, well, let me see the lesson. And I'm like, well, it's more than that, right? And so all of us are bringing together these different perspectives, but all of us are very social justice oriented. We're very racially aware. And this is just, we felt like the chapter was a way to not only, yes, we're drawing from theory, but show really what does it look like within Buffalo and how are we rolling these things out? And I just want to make sure that it's bringing these voices together. All right, so I'm going to spend very little time on this because if you read the chapter, if not, go back. I would recommend just looking at the environmental justice write-up that we did, and we used the literature and a lot of the work of environmental justice. You see a picture there of Robert Bullard. He is considered the father or grandfather, depending on who you talk to, of environmental justice. So if you are in this field and you have not read his work, he has at least 19 books, and he's a sociologist by trade. Right. And so that's another beautiful part, right? So you don't have to have this STEM background. He was telling the stories of Black people during the civil rights movement, and he describes the environmental justice movement is a racial movement. Right. And we have to remember that. And so in this particular piece, we brought in intentionally, because if you read the environmental justice literature, you get some of that. But because we were also making a connection to education, we wanted to make a clear connection using critical race theory, right? So environmental justice education basically talks about how where we find, the way I boil it down is typically where we treat the environment poorly is also how we treat those people that occupy that space. Right? So that's the simplest version of environmental justice. Now, the literature can talk about everything from sustainability to where hazardous waste sites are. So it's going to change depending on where you are, based on if you're in a rural space or a urban space. And again, this literature was developed out of Black rural areas. Right. So, and I think we miss some of that sometimes when we talk about urban spaces. Now, critical race theory allowed us to do a few things. One, I don't have to prove, or we didn't have to prove that racism exists. Critical race theory comes out of the legal field and has been around for decades. And basically it was a way for legal scholars to say, well, wait a minute, we're changing laws as we go to allow white people to be the perpetual winners, right? So if we see a rule is working and people of color are starting to catch up, we're saying, oh no, we got to change that rule, right? And it depends on what system you're in. So they say critical race theory needs to be interdisciplinary. So again, depending on your context, it's going to look different. And that's another thing that the theory allows us to say is that racism will morph over time. Right. So what it looked like in the 50s is not what it looks like all the time today, but we know that it's still present. It's just, what does it look like? Also, it allows us to center the stories of others and really value. I'm sorry. She just wants to help me present. She gets all hyped when I get hyped. So, really centering my mother just got here. Thank you. You can take her. Welcome to my home where sausage is made. Okay, so critical race theory allowed us to do that. Also, one of the things that I think is really important that we drew out in this piece, and that I've been centering in a lot of the STEM work, is the whiteness as property. And it looks different depending on where you are and what you're doing. And again, go back and look at how we've written that. But basically what whiteness as property is this. Previously, right, it was only that white people were able to own land, and it looks completely different today. right? So we're thinking about things like redlining. Now we can talk about, well, what property has value? Well, the things that are less valuable, okay, we'll let, people of color own that. But the things that are of value, well, wait a minute, we might put structures in place that will actually push out people of color. And here's the thing about racism that we can draw from critical race theory, right? It looks normal. It is rationalized, right? So the stuff that we talk about, the pushing against, it's pushing against what we have always typically done. And a lot of times it can come through in deficit language, right? It can come through with how we treat people. Sometimes it's a policy we put in place. Sometimes it's access to resources, right? And so we're drawing on all of these different things that shows the complicated space that racism can operate. Because sometimes people try to boil it down to is, do I like or am I accepting of people of color? And if we're still at that very low level understanding of how racism has operated, we're going to miss the large scale issues that are keeping us behind when it comes to STEM innovation. We're locking out people of color, right? And we know historically, if you allow them into those spaces and allow them to truly create, you're actually going to have more innovation, right? And so we have problems that we need people of color to be present for, and we need to stop shutting them out. Also, when it comes to these environmental justice issues, how are we positioning them, right? So when we're talking about even the people at Standing Rock, right? We're not positioning them as environmentalists, right? They're being criminalized, right? So who is getting criminalized and who isn't? Right. So think about what is it? Was it Glenda? Where's the young white girl? Where is she from again? She gets all of these praises about her efforts towards climate justice, but let our kids in Buffalo who go to Eve school say they want to just get on the bus and go protest. It's like, well, wait a minute. You ain't just gonna leave this building. You're not gonna just protest, right? So you see how race comes into play on who we're allowing to protest, right? So, and how that plays out. And one of the things we focus on is whiteness and environmental education. And so coming from the STEM education literature, I wasn't too surprised about what it looked like, right? So basically, we need to expand our definition of environment. And Eve talks about that a lot just in conversations with her, right? It is not just these distal nature preserved places, but it is also where your kids go to school. It is also the communities that they live in. It is also any place in space that you occupy is also an environment. So now what does that mean for environmental education as we have been approaching it, right? And when we're thinking about access, and oftentimes we see children of color, and we mentioned that in our materials, children of color are often positioned as in a deficit where we're doing outreach to them. Like, look at how wonderful is that? The Black and brown children are on the nature preserve and take pictures of them, right? So we're positioning them in a deficit, not recognizing all of the issues with access that have constructed environments that have shut them out, right? And so we as the environmental education, we have to think about that because we have a lot of work that needs to be done. Right. So not approaching groups with deficit, recognizing that even in environmental education. So that was one of the things that we bring out in that piece, that the environment has now or is a racialized place. And we have to recognize it as such. It is not this race neutral place. Just because you put kids on a bus and take them out to go hiking or whatever it is you're going to do, that is still a racialized environment. And how are you constructing it in a way where kids feel included? They're not being treated in a deficit, and the things that they have learned along the way matter. All right, and I think that's all I have for theory, but those were the things that pretty much drove what we did.
Okay, so Monica showed me this crazy purple map one day, and we were trying to make sense of this potential environmental justice area. And actually, you can see these maps for your own communities. But we started looking at it and trying to figure out what was the federal government saying to us when it's labeling all these purple areas in our neighborhoods potential environmental justice areas. So we started making connections because we know our city, we know our county. And so we were looking at all of these impacted, environmentally disturbed, environmentally compromised places, which is what you see in the purple. and looking at what we know of our city and realizing that all of those spaces are spaces where Black and brown folks live. And in the wider county, because of my years in teaching were spent in a rural community, although I'm a city dweller. So we looked at that area as well. And I noticed that there was a big purple chunk there where the Seneca Tonawanda Reservation was. And so we started having these conversations around, well, what is the government saying to us? These are potential environmental justice areas. So this means that potentially people in those neighborhoods are going to be cleaning up these areas. So, you know, we have within this county and our neighboring county in Niagara, we have Superfund sites, right? Like companies have come into our cities and, you know, joined in and pushed themselves into neighborhoods that brought with them all kinds of potential carcinogens, pollutants, and then they left, right? We're a Rust Belt city. Those factories, some of them are still sitting in the middle of our neighborhoods. And so we started looking at cancer clusters, and we're finding that throughout certain areas of our city where it's all overlaid, right? So that we know that these are former industrial sites, now they're brownfields, and they're also the purple in these potential environmental justice areas. So many of our students in the city of Buffalo live within these boundaries. And in fact, when we first looked at it with Eve, right away she said, oh, there's my street. Hey, that's where I live. And so that became our title, because we're realizing how all of this overlay is impacting not just us, but our students and our communities. And back to what Monica was talking about spaces and how, you know, racism is codified within all of our structures within the city. So when we think about our green neighborhoods, our clean neighborhoods, our bike path neighborhoods, they are not the purple neighborhoods. And so that's where the white folks live. And so now with gentrification, we predict that we will be seeing some cleanup going on, because as white people move into those neighborhoods, things have to change. And so our government will make that happen. And so we're bringing this to our students and thinking about how we have to know where our students live, right? Going back to the whole idea of knowing your students, knowing their environment. Maybe you live in the same community that your students live in, and so you can talk to them about what do your neighborhoods look like. And so not knowing as an environmentalists and also as social justice teachers, we want to have conversations with kids about this map. And so Eve brought the map to her class. And I know she's going to talk more about what she did with her survey and her students. I'm just going to talk very quickly about our website survey. So in all of our conversations around the dining room table, we're looking at this map, and we're also talking about, well, who are the environmentalists in our community? So I was familiar with this group called PPG, which is Partnership for Public Good. And they're sort of an umbrella organization, and you can become a partner. Your organization can become a partner, and we sustain each other, and we do research, and there's a legal team, and it's a really super helpful organization. So we started looking at the organizations within PPG that identify themselves as environmental. And so we decided that we wanted to look at, okay, so we have this huge potential for environmental justice within our community. Who are the people in our community who are doing the environmental work? And so we started looking at websites to see how who's represented on those websites. So you can see on this slide how we started to look at and sort of collect data from these environmental websites in Western New York. And we looked at things like how many people of color are represented on the website? Who are the board of directors or the trustees, and how many people of color are on those boards? And so what we found was, although there were some groups that did represent people of color on their websites, they were mostly in the outreach capacity, which Monica has mentioned before. And also we had some really disturbing results in terms of board of directors and the trustees and the representation of people of color, because the people of color are living in those impacted neighborhoods, but they are not on the boards or making decisions about their communities in terms of environmentalism. And so we felt that this was super important for our community to know, so that these partners can start reaching out and engaging their community members within them, so that we can go forward as a community that's knowledgeable about racism, that understands the barriers that are in place, so that they can be changed. Okay, Eve is going to talk a little bit about the student survey. So that was the third arm of this idea.
Well, I'm going to first start talking a little bit about how I do class. And I have embraced restorative practices. And if you are going into education and you don't know about them, please find out. And last year, I started the year with being in Circle, and we had Student Talk Tuesday every single Tuesday. And this is a real good way to get to know your students as people and find out about their experiences. And also the other part that sometimes is scary as a teacher is ask them for feedback about what's working and not working in their class. You know, I think college professors are used to asking that. Elementary, high school teachers, we just think we know it. And this is the way it goes. Don't give me feedback. You're a child, I'm the adult. And that's another barrier that we want to make sure we're breaking down with students, is mutual respect. Because if I am the person in charge, especially as a white woman in charge of mainly Black and brown students, you know, there's multiple power dynamics to that you want to break down. So sitting in Circle, we're all equal. And so I spent every Tuesday in Circle with my students, and a lot of the deeper discussion about how they were responding to what we were learning came out of those circles. And I started the year with teaching them about climate strike, because again, as a teacher, I thought one of the things that the children are not experiencing is this whole empowerment. Here they are, they're transitioning from being a minor to being a full adult. And a lot of times nobody's talking to them about civic engagement and how important it is to have a voice, whatever your belief is, to be able to, you know, take your voice and amplify it and make change, whether that's through voting, whether it's through public speaking to your elected officials, lobbying, letters to the editor, running for office, all of that. I talk to my students about all those possibilities that they can do. So, so the first thing that we wanted to ask them about is what did they imagine an environmental scientist to be? Because when I think about scientists in general, I think of like Bill Nye the Science Guy. You know, I think of a middle-aged white man in a lab coat and a tie. That's what I think. And so I wanted to find out whether, you know, how the kids saw themselves, because we all have this responsibility in the environmental justice movement. And if they didn't see themselves in it, of course, they're not going to take on that responsibility. And then the next question, you know, was about the definition of environmental justice and what does it look like in the Buffalo region? And then the last one is kind of evaluating the issues in the Buffalo region. And I was actually pleasantly surprised at seeing that although the students did often come up with a certain demographic, just as many of them came up with, you know, environmental science is for everybody, environmental justice is for everybody. So that's one thing that I felt like what I was doing in the classroom was actually allowing them to break out of some of this mold that, that, you know, I think when we looked at those websites, you know, luckily the kids weren't thinking the same way that the websites were thinking about them as scientists. And over the course of the year, they did feel very empowered to do things. Like they ran a petition. They spoke at a Common Council meeting. Well, a handful of students went to the Common Council meeting with comments from every student in the class that they brought with them. So it's very important to look at where you are and also what opportunities do, you know, I'm supposed to be facilitating, not directing. So what opportunities do the kids have to really interact with the issues that are important to them in their community? And sometimes it's not the same ones as I think I would pick, but it's also giving them that freedom because that is science. So because Buffalo is a city, you're seeing a lot of the urban issues that affect environmental justice. You're looking at food deserts. You're looking at the visible pollution of littering. And you're looking at homelessness and also poor conditions inside homes, because those are all the issues that are very much right there in front of them. And again, environmental justice being place-based. You know, we just think of environmental too much of these great preserved lands and preserving lands. But one of the things we discussed yesterday in prep for this is when we're talking about waterways, what does the sewer system look like? I personally live on the Shadaqua Creek, and that is a highly polluted creek that actually, you know, you could follow it from a suburb where the factory is polluting it all the way down to the Niagara River and the communities in which it goes through and how polluted it is, bringing this pollution down, and that it's not a recreational resource really, or and of course it's bringing pollution into the Great Lakes system as well. But so that's something that we've looked at. And also I live in a neighborhood of brownfields. I'm in one of the most brownfield neighborhood in the city. And that's something that I did again when I share with my students, since I live in the same community that they do. I'm able to bring some of my own experiences of, I bought this house 4.5 years ago, and it was a great opportunity in other ways, but I didn't look at the land usage around my house and how deeply brownfield it was. But then I was able to, when we looked at land maps and everyone did a land map of their neighborhood, I was able to do my house and my block first and kind of talk about some of the things that, you know, were assets when I bought it. Like I live right next to the expressway entrance. That's great, except environmentally horrible. And I was able to have some of the kids who actually lived in some projects. They looked at their house, having looked at my neighborhood first. They were able to proudly share the parkland that was included in their community, which is a different way to see it, you know, because honestly, being from the projects, you usually don't have a lot of pride in what your block looks like. But when you look at it from an environmental perspective, it actually was a better location than where I live.